Hello there, I'm Eric Medcalf and I'm Deputy Head of the Counselling and Psychological Service here at Glasgow University, and I'm going to present to you today a short presentation on stress entitled De-Stress, Not Distress, and in it I'm going to present some fairly basic ideas about stress and anxiety and some ways in which that we can help deal with that in our everyday lives and make it less impactful on our activities. Stress isn't always a bad thing. But the kind of stress we're talking about today is that the stress that arises from a perception that the challenges of a situation are greater than our ability to cope. That the challenges of a situation are greater than our ability to cope. Sometimes stress can be quite helpful. It can enable us to do things that we might not ordinarily be able to do in our everyday life. We might be running away from something so fast that we might almost equal the time of an Olympic runner. But that is the kind of stress that helps us to achieve things. And what we're talking about today is stress that arises from a perception that the challenges of a situation are greater than our ability to cope. This kind of stress involves a perception of threat to our, amongst other things, our personal safety, our self-esteem, our status, our expected or hoped for future, and any of the above as they affect others who are close to us. You'll know if someone walks into the room that you care for and they seem to be under stress, that has an impact on you. It kind of vibrates from them and you pick it up. So it's not just about you, it's about others around you in your everyday lives, especially those with whom you are very close. Threat involves a perceived loss of control. Now, this is very important. The more generally you feel you need to be in control, the more it is likely that you will perceive something as a threat. So this is an important time for you to reflect on what kind of person you are. Are you the kind of person who, if the bus is 30 seconds late, get uptight, agitated, fidgety, even annoyed? Are you the kind of person that if a book isn't on the place where you want it to be on your shelf, you get agitated, you feel anxious about it? Or are you one of those people that just sits back and, if the bus isn't here, I'll just hang around a bit, and if I know, that's an interesting, that kind of, are you very laid back or are you very much someone who likes to be in control? It's important that you're aware of that element of yourself, because if you're someone who likes to be in control a lot, it's more likely that you'll perceive something as a threat. And if you perceive something as a threat, it's going to result in a sense of loss of control, and you'll get anxious. And we get anxious in the face of something that threatens us. And anxiety, and this is another important thing, anxiety is a call to action. And if we don't act, if we experience all the things that go on inside of us, in our bodies and in our heads, and we experience that happening to us and we don't do anything about it, we might then get anxious about being anxious, as if our anxiety also threatens our ability to be in control. And this then sets up a cyclic situation where a response that can be helpful becomes one that is unhelpful. Okay, so let's look at some more academic or technical definitions of anxiety. First, it's important to realize that it's a normal human emotion. In moderation, anxiety stimulates an anticipatory and adaptive response to challenging or stressful events. In excess, which is the kind of things we're talking about here, anxiety destabilizes the individual and a dysfunctional state results. It's considered excessive or pathological when it arises in the absence of a challenge or stress, when we get just anxious and we don't know why, and when it's out of proportion to the challenge or stress in duration or severity. Most of us are aware that people have odd phobias. They might be scared of spiders or things like that. And unless you live somewhere like Australia, generally there's no real reason to be worried about spiders. But we sometimes get very anxious about that. And that's due to a whole lot of different factors. And that's the kind of anxiety that is pathological, excessive. And then it results in significant distress. And when it results in that kind of distress, we have psychological, social, occupational, biological, and other kinds of impairment. Most of you will know that we generally call anxiety the flight or fight response. It's a physiological response that in essence helps us to deal with dangerous or threatening situations. It's something we share with the whole animal kingdom, whether you're a fish, an antelope, a tiger, or whatever. Some people also might say that the plant kingdom has these kind of things, but we won't go into that now. The flight or fight response is something that we share with the whole animal kingdom that helps us to deal with dangerous or threatening situations. And that anxiety, that flight or fight response, helps us prepare for action to deal with threat. Flight or fight, two forms of action to deal with something that threatens us. Classically, it's if a tiger is coming out of the jungle, we have a choice. Do we fight it or do we run away? Most of us would probably try to run away. We'd certainly feel very, very anxious, very, very frightened. But the stimulus is for us to do something with that anxiety. And when we don't take action, when we don't put ourselves into action to deal with the threat, when we freeze, this physiological response can become one that becomes embedded and habitual. Our muscles get tense. If they're tense for too long, various things happen in our muscles that makes us more stiff, more prone to pain and tension. And it becomes habitual, because our bodies are very good at forming habits. Sometimes they might be habits that we're not aware of, like scratching our heads, touching our beard, all that kind of thing. But they are physiological habits that we develop very easily, most of which are completely benign. Some might be things that start to get in the way of our everyday lives. And the habit of anxiety can be one of those things as well. So let's look at how we intervene in this process. If we're going to intervene in this cycle of stress, we have to examine our perception of the threat and deal with our physiological response. We have to look at what goes on in our heads in relation to the way we think about things and how we see things, and also what's going on in our body when all this is going on. So I've come up with 6 R's. I used just to have 5, but I invented another one. And these R's are recognition, reflection, rethinking, rehearsing, relaxation, and recreation. 6 ways of thinking about stress and doing something about it. So let's look first at recognizing. How do you know that you're under stress? Just spend a couple of moments now thinking about this. What's going on for you that makes you know that you're stressed? It could be a physical thing, could be a social thing, it could be something that's going on in your head, psychological side. So just think about what's going on for you when you get stressed. So these are some of the things that happen for you. Your pulse rate is likely to rise. And if you think about a call to action involving your body, your muscles, you need to have more blood going to your muscles to help deal with your need to take action in the face of threat. So the pulse rate rises to send that blood around. Your blood also needs more oxygen, so your breathing is likely to increase. You're likely to have tense muscles to help prepare you for action. You're also likely to have poor sleep. Now, one of the reasons for this is because if you think about being alert to danger, you'll become aware of lots of things that are going on around you. You'll be thinking about ways of dealing with it. you'll be very awake, because anxiety is a form of arousal. We're more alive, more aware of our surroundings and what's going on in our body when we feel aroused, which is entirely the opposite to trying to sleep, when we want to be as less aroused as we can be, less distracted by thoughts, less tense in our body. We need to be more relaxed. So it's not surprising that we lose sleep when we get anxious and stressed. We're also likely to be agitated. Now, agitation is a very interesting thing. It's like very small movements in our body. We want to move, but we're not really allowing ourselves to do this properly. We're holding on, we're frustrating that need to take action. And sometimes I think that slips out and we might start to shake. We might just want to move around, moving from one foot to another. We might be jiggly or whatever. All as forms of action that are frustrated, real action to deal with threat. So that's what can happen with us. We get agitated. We might also get headaches. Headaches are very often to do with muscle tension in the back of the neck, restrictions of the blood vessels, that kind of thing. So that is likely to happen if you get very stressed, and that's one of the ways that you deal with it. But one word of warning here, headaches happen for other reasons as well. If you find yourself getting headaches quite frequently, it's a really good idea to see a doctor about this. Similarly, digestive issues. If you have constant digestive problems, do talk it over with your doctor. But one of the ways of thinking about digestion when we get stressed is that the blood supply needs to go somewhere else apart from our digestive system. Our body doesn't want to be bothered with digesting food when we're faced with imminent danger. So our body's digestive system will close down, and at its most extreme, and you know what I'm talking about, your body might want to get rid of the contents of your digestive system in one direction or another when you're under severe stress. So that's another factor that goes on in your body when you feel stressed. You might also get irritable. Irritability is a form of restricted anger. You might want to get really angry, a form of the fight, really. That's a way of thinking about fight. You might find yourself getting really angry about something that's going on for you, but you can't express that. Something around you, the social situation, doesn't allow you to deal with that. So the anger might slip out and affect other aspects of your life. You might go to the post office and you get the wrong change, so you get really irritated with the person behind the counter who's got nothing to do with the stress in your life, but you're dumping it on them as a form of being very irritated and a form of taking some little small actions in order to deal with stress that actually comes from another part of your life. You might also become hyper alert. This once again is this being aroused in the face of danger. If you're going to a jungle or something, you hear lots of strange sounds, you'll be looking around you a lot in a way to watch out for danger. Now that takes up a lot of space in your brain, and it might lead, particularly if you're trying to do something which involves a lot of concentration on one particular thing, that you can't concentrate on it because you're thinking about so many other things. Sometimes I like to think of hyper-alertness as if it's like time slowing down. You know, if you've been in a car accident or anything like that, sometimes it seems as if time slowed down. It's not that time slowed down, or we could probably have a debate about that, but what actually happened, you became much more alert to what would be going on around you. The resolution of your vision and your thoughts would have been much finer because you had to watch out for danger, and your arousal put you in a position where you might have to take action because something else might be going to happen. The next R is reflection. What's going on now that might be triggering my stress? Might be something that's quite obvious. There might be a tiger coming out of the jungle, or you might be really worried about an exam coming up or something like that. So it's good that you know why you're stressed. Sometimes you might not know. It might be something going on in the background of your life which all of a sudden has triggered something that you're not aware of. So doing a little bit of searching around that will be quite an important thing to do. I'm often reminded of situational things that can repeat without the original cause of the stress. For instance, if I was walking down the street one day and there was a really bad car accident in front of me, I would associate that part of the street with the feelings that were aroused in me when I saw that accident. So maybe if I'm walking down there a couple of days later, there's no accident, but I might have a sudden resurgence of those feelings that were there when I saw the accident. So these are the kind of things that it's useful to become aware of. Why am I getting anxious here now? It could even be something like a smell that you associate with something that happened way back then, but is not actually happening now. But the smell triggers that memory for you. And smell is a very significant trigger for memories. I think it's the oldest form of memory that we can have. You know, if we smell a milk from our mother's breast, it stays with us for a long time, and I'm sure that advertising agencies and people like that make full good use of that kind of process. So being aware of what's triggering your stress now is really important, because if you know that it's something from the past and not in the present, that's going to help you to deal with the feelings that you've got as a result of that. We also might have thoughts that trigger our stress. These can be thoughts about things that happened in the past. We might be saying to ourselves, oh, if only I'd done that, if only I'd done that. It might be a perception of a current threat. Why am I feeling threatened now, like walking down the street where there was a car accident? That we're thinking about something in a particular way that makes us feel threatened. Or we might be worried about something that's going to happen in the future. What if this happens? What if that happens? We ask ourselves all these questions. So the challenge now is to rethink some of those things, to challenge our perceptions and our thoughts about whatever it is making us feel stressed. First, are they true? Is this really something that's going on now? Is it really something that I need to be worried about? I'm reminded of once I visited a zoo. I don't often go to zoos, but this was a zoo where there were lions in a big enclosure, lots of fields they could wander around, etc. But the zoo, being an entertainment organisation, had also built this plastic cave that you could walk down into. And I walked down these plastic steps into this thing and came face to face with a full-grown male lion. I nearly jumped out of my skin. And then I realized that I had no reason to be afraid in this situation, because there was a piece of plate glass about that thick between me and the lion. So I had no real reason to be worried there. So I kind of rethought what I was seeing. My perceptions, my first impulse, and this is something that goes outside of the thinking process, was to be very frightened because I was faced with this great thing. But my thinking overcame that, and I thought it out, and I was less anxious because of this. Also, some of our thoughts might be helpful and some of our thoughts might not be helpful. Sometimes our thoughts can be what I would call wolves in sheep's clothing. They're things that disguise themselves as trying to be helpful, but in the end actually make you more anxious and you don't feel helped. For instance, if you are say you only get 90% in an exam, and you say to yourself, that wasn't good enough, you've got to get 100%, as if it's that some kind of encouragement. But if you're saying that to yourself, do you actually feel encouraged and stimulated? You might feel that your 90% wasn't really good enough, and you might feel down because of that, and get really anxious about the next exam because you feel like you've got to do better and better. And that kind of seemingly encouraging message may not actually encourage you. It actually discourages you and makes you feel more stressed. So it's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Also, we've got old, redundant ways of thinking about things. We might have patterns of thinking about things that make us say, for instance, I always get anxious in exams, or particularly things about self-esteem. I'm no good at this, that kind of thing. This is old habits of thinking that we can actually challenge. We can put those thoughts in the witness box in the court of our brain and say, is this really true? What evidence have you got for this that makes you believe this? What evidence have you got that you don't do well in exams? And you look back over all the years you've been doing the exams and you realize that generally you've got A's and B's. You've done pretty well in those exams. So there may be no evidence for that, but it might be an old way of thinking that you need to put in the witness box in your brain and say, this is not true. I challenge those thoughts. So let's think about the kind of thoughts about the past, if only thoughts. These are thoughts about past events that might regularly make you feel, for example, guilty or embarrassed or ashamed or anxious. You keep going over things that have happened in the past that really happened then, not now, but are continuing to make you feel stressed and anxious. So let's rethink some of these now. If we're saying, if only I did this, if only I'd done that, we can say to ourselves, that was then. I've learnt from that and will do it very differently next time. And notice the wording of what I've said here. I've learnt from that and will do it differently next time. There's action words in this. And that's an important element. Sometimes actions are things that you do, but they can also be things that you decide to do. And deciding to take action can be a way of reducing your stress. A bit like making lists, I suppose. You're making decisions to do things in the future. You might also say, I can't change what happened, so I'll just need to let it go. Now that letting it go is another important set of words that we might use a lot if we do a relaxation exercise. Now there is a relaxation exercise associated with this presentation that you can use that's very much based on letting it go with your breathing. So if you say to yourself, I can't change what happened, I'll just let it go, then you're beginning to change the influence of those things that happened in the past on your life in the present. You might also say that you've tried to make amends. You've tried to do something about what happened, particularly if you injured somebody or you insulted them or something like that. You've tried to make it up to them. And if you tried to do that, if you have taken action, you can say, I tried to take action and will now let it go. You'll let it go with your body as well as your thinking. Or, here's another form of action. You can say, I plan to make amends and trust that that then will be the end of it. I'm going to do something in the future and hope that that's going to mean that's the end of it. Now, what about the future? How often do we say, what if this happens, what if that happens, and get really anxious about it? And I like to think that when we say, what if, and we don't say anything after that, we're kind of falling into a pit. We're falling into a pit of despair, of catastrophizing, something that makes us feel really bad, anxious and stressed because we haven't really thought it through properly. It's a question that often implies disaster. So what we need to do here is actually answer the question. What would you do if, for instance, what if the bus doesn't come? Well, what if the bus doesn't come? What choices do we have? We find out what time the next bus is going to come. Action. We might say, I've got to call the friend, say that I'm going to be late. Action again. Look at the timetable. Action. Think about calling a taxi. Action. We will do things as a result of that what if. We will answer the question and have a list of possible things that we can do in order to make us feel better, rather than fall into that pit of despair. And then we can work through the what-ifs one by one. And then, if we actually don't know what we will do, then maybe we should just let it go, because there's actually nothing we can do. As we sometimes do things that are called self-fulfilling prophecies. We might be saying, I always do this. I know that'll happen. Particularly about exams and that sort of thing. I always mess up the last question. Or I know that I will always forget my pen, things like that. These have become self-fulfilling prophecies, because if you get very anxious about that, you're more likely to make it happen. We suffer from anticipatory anxiety about a threat that may not actually happen, but actually then might make it more likely to happen. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you need to be very careful about that kind of thing, because we're rehearsing the future. And when we rehearse the future, when we imagine something going wrong, we increase the chances of it happening. If you were a footballer taking a penalty kick in front of a goal with just a goalkeeper, and you imagined that you were going to kick the ball over the bar, it's much more likely that that's going to happen. If you imagine it's going to go in the top left-hand corner of the net while the goalkeeper goes the other way, you're much more likely to increase the chances of it happening that way. It's not guaranteed, unfortunately, but it is one of those things that we need to think about. How we imagine something is a way of making it happen, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And here's something to think about as well. It's a bit of a philosophical question. Just because something happened in the past, there's actually no logical reason why it has to happen in the future. We know that uncertainty theory gives all these things. We know that there's no real guarantee that the sun will rise in the morning. And if you live in Glasgow, that's probably quite likely to be the case. If you know that it's going to happen, generally you can predict that it's a probable thing that will happen. But if we're making predictions about our anxiety, about things that are going to happen to us, it's not really helpful to think that that's always going to happen. So history doesn't have to repeat. We can do something about it. Okay, now let's think about relaxation. Remember what I was saying about our body remembering old habits? Like if you drive a car or play the piano, you know after a while that your body remembers what to do. You don't need to think about it. If you drive a manual car, you don't really need to think about putting the clutch down when you change gear. You do it quite automatically. If you're playing scales on the piano, your body knows what to do. You don't really think about each note one by one. And it's the same with anxiety. Anxiety, that old anxiety habit, goes along whether you think about it or not. So if you tell yourself, oh, just relax now, that goes some of the way to helping you to relax. But if your body is still saying, no, we've got real reason to be afraid here, and if your body is saying panic, that's not going to work. Just telling yourself to relax isn't what really helps. What really will help is you taking charge of your physiological stress reactions as well as rethinking your perceptions of threat. So if you learn and practice a relaxation technique, that will then enable you to take charge of your body's flight or fight response. And you will reduce your heart rate, you will relax your muscles, and you will calm your mind. And when you've learned how to do this, and it does take practice, because remember you're moving one habit in the place of another one, when you've learned how to do this, you're really able to let it go when you say that to yourself. And then, of course, there's recreation. This is the fight or flight. This is the putting your body into action to help deal with this stress response. And it's well known now how physical activity can help, not just with anxiety, with depression, lots of other things. It can be extreme doing things with your body. And it will turn your flight or fight response into action. And if this suits your personal style more than relaxation, just do it. But sometimes you might not be able to do it. For instance, say if you're in an exam and you have this flight or fight response, it's not really going to be helpful for you to stand up, throw the desk across the room and run out. It's much more likely that you're going to need to use some kind of relaxation technique. But if you find yourself in the evening getting very, very tense about something, and you go out for a walk, maybe quite a brisk walk probably, and that will then use up some of that flight or fight energy, and then you go home, you're more likely to be able to do the stuff that you need to do because you've used some of that flight or fight response. Okay, just some last words now. This is some wise words from a Chinese philosopher, Lao Tzu, and he says, if you're depressed, you're living in the past. If you're anxious, you're living in the future. And if you're at peace, you're living in the present. That's the end of this formal presentation. After this, you will be able to listen to a relaxation technique. Now, this technique is something that initially takes about 15 to 20 minutes, so whilst you're learning it. But there are elements of it that you'll be able to use in your everyday life as soon as you recognize that you might be becoming anxious. You'll notice things going on in your body or in your brain that are the pointers that you're starting to get stressed. And if you feel that and you've learnt this relaxation technique, particularly the breathing element of it, you'll be able to take action with your breathing then in order to reduce what's going on in your brain and your body. And actually knowing that you can do that will also give you a sense of being more in control. So take some time to listen to the relaxation technique, to practice it, to find a quiet space somewhere where you can just do it. Practice it best every day, morning and evening if you can do it. It can be quite useful for getting off to sleep. And then after a while, you'll just know what to do. You'll have created a habit of relaxation to replace a habit of being anxious. So take some time now just to spend relaxing, listening to what the recording says, and then use it as often as you like in order to help yourself develop that habit of relaxation. Thank you very much.